Bronxville Speaker Series sponsored by the Bronxville Democratic Committee. Tonight's topic is, does a rising tide truly lift all boats? Why Americans are divided and angry about the economic outcomes of the last 50 years. Happy to sign at any time at the end. Now, let me start off with introductions. Our guest speaker tonight is David N. Gibbs. He is professor of history at the University of Arizona. He has published extensively on the Democratic Republic of the Congo, former Yugoslavia, Afghanistan, and U.S. economic history. Revolt of the Rich is his third book. Interviewing him tonight will be Sarah Cliffe. Sarah Cliffe is an economist who worked for 30 years as a director at the World Bank. She served as Assistant Secretary General at the UN, worked in the trade union movement, business, and academia. I'll turn it over to Sarah.
Thank you. Thank you, Bill. Does everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Well, good. So I'm very pleased to welcome everyone tonight, as Bill said, to the third in our speaker series here. The idea of the speaker series is to be able to create a space to debate some of the issues that are important today and often quite sensitive and that can act to divide us. So this is, as I said, the third. We had one on geopolitics and foreign policy, an awful lot going on in that area today. We had George Latimer come here to talk about what is happening on the national scene and be able to answer some questions on that. And we're now very happy to be able to welcome David Gibbs. And when I was thinking about this session, which is on the economy, I was thinking about the period just before the election when I was both researching and canvassing, and I found that the absolutely key issues that were coming up on people's doorsteps were the economy, probably number one, immigration and cultural issues, all of those sensitive issues and issues that can divide us. Hopefully we'll have a chance in this series to talk about all of them, but tonight's session is very much on the history of economic shifts in the US and on inequality, and why there is such a division between people's views of what has happened in this country economically in the last 50 years. So with that, I'll get right into it. We'll hope to have, I think, 30 to 45 minutes just exchange, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. I hope people will come forward with questions. David also tells me he's very happy to take questions in the middle of the session on anything he says, so please just raise your hand if you have a thought as we're talking. So David, if we're going to some of the basics of this, what has happened in terms of inequality of incomes, wealth, health and education in America over the last 50 years?
Okay, until the early 70s, you had what I would call the class compromise, basically the extended New Deal, in which you really did have kind of I guess in Europe they call it social democracy, but it was kind of a very weak version of social democracy compared to, let's say, Germany or Sweden. But nevertheless, you did have a very significant reduction in the gap between the rich and the poor. This is very well documented, especially by the French economist Thomas Piketty. There was also high rates of economic growth and high rates of performance by the economy, and people had reason to believe that things would get better over time, decade after decade, generation after generation. And that basically stopped in the 1970s. The 70s was a crisis period. And from the late 70s onward, you began getting a dramatic reconcentration of wealth that basically reversed all the gains, all of them, of the extended New Deal. And we're pretty much back to the pre-New Deal period in terms of wealth division in the United States. Also, the economy never really regained its dynamism of the 50s and 60s. It's been far less dynamic. That's true, by the way, at the global level as well. Some have called the period post-1979 the period of Milton Friedman, as indeed it unquestionably was the period of Milton Friedman. But it was Friedman's economics that was driving this in the US and globally. And that's true. What we have to, if you look at the aggregate macroeconomic data, however, what we're seeing is the era of Milton Friedman is a period of dramatically lowered economic performance, and that's just a matter of fact. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, others can decide for themselves, but that's clearly what the data show. And the question is, my book is about why did that happen, all right? How did that take place? And again, the pivot point was the 1970s. And what happened in the 1970s was that business interests and wealthy individuals would mostly countenance the class compromise and basically gave it a pass, shall we say, and were willing to accept things like redistributive taxation, labor unions, a mild version of the welfare state, those types of things, changed their minds. And what caused them to change their minds were two things. One was the rate of profit, wages from going down. And so as inflation went up, wages tended to go up. It was called the wage price spiral, is what it was called. And it maintained wages through most of the decade, even in spite of inflation. And so wages were maintained, and a big complaint of the wealthy was that in order to crush inflation, we have to reduce wages, which is eventually what they did. So the issue was that the economy was performing badly, and if the economy is performing badly, somebody has to pay. And the rich felt that it should be the middle and working classes that should pay, which is exactly what happened, to pay for the lowered economic performance. I can go into later, if people want me to, theories as to why the economy performed badly. That's a separate issue. But the key point is, we had a crisis in the economy, and the question is, who is going to pay? And that's a political issue. That's a political issue. And so you had an organizing of the very wealthy that was for a lobbying campaign that was one of the most massive, the most massive, I would say, in American history, who had a tremendous amount of money poured into what I would call deep lobbying. When one thinks of lobbying, one thinks of lobbyists on K Street going in and twisting congressmen and congresswomen's arms and things like that. Deep lobbying is where you found think tanks that are legally not considered lobbies, but they lobby the climate of opinion. They lobby the climate of opinion. And so this was done on a massive scale throughout the 70s, and it began to bear fruit towards the end of the decade. Last 2 years of the Carter presidency, I would say, is when the giant ship of state turned, basically, in what we now call a neoliberal direction. And you began getting the redistribution of wealth upwards began. Contrary to popular belief, by the way, this did not begin under Reagan. It began under Carter, okay? And if you want to basically say who deserves the credit or the blame, you can decide if it's credit or blame. I'll leave it to others to decide. Who deserves the credit or the blame? I would say Carter deserves more of it than Reagan, because he got the ball rolling. Even if the mythology has Reagan as the main instigator of this, he was not the instigator. He continued the policies that were firmly in place already under President Carter.
Thanks. So we knew that this was going to be a kind of vibrant discussion. I think that point about what's happened in different administrations historically is going to be a good one for us to discuss further. Just before we go to some more detailed questions, then, could you comment a little bit on some of the key figures about why we are concerned about this divided outcome for different Americans? And I'm thinking here about health, incomes, wealth, etc.
Well, it's the whole American idea is rising living standards. Even before the New Deal, immigrants came to the United States in large numbers, largely because the U.S. had the highest living standards in the world, with an accelerating rate of increase. Also, I should add, earlier in history, Europe had a much greater inequality than the United States. And ironically, one of the most unequal places in the world was Sweden. Sweden actually is a dramatic case of how policy can change the structure of society, as it did in Sweden. But nevertheless, you did have the American idea of ones where your life would get better and better, and your children's life would be even better than yours. And this would continue, ad infinitum, basically. And that ended in the 70s, and it never recovered. The average male wage is probably lower today than it was in 1970. Wages never recovered for large parts of the population. You've had declining health standards for large segments of the population. As everyone knows, U.S. health standards are some of the very lowest in the world among rich countries. And for certain elements in the working class, life expectancy has in fact gone down. Deaths of despair, as has been documented, is among working class Americans, especially those in distressed areas with high unemployment, deindustrialization. Health standards have been devastated by this, and it produces other obvious problems. You know, you have the opioid crisis, which is particularly severe in deindustrialized areas, and it cuts across racial lines, as everyone knows, but it's very much a class issue to some degree. And so there are a lot of miserable people in the United States, more so than before. And that's a direct result of these changes. Also one more thing is that it produces political dysfunction. There's basically a deep alienation among many parts of the country, especially among the working classes. It's been well documented that the Republican Party, for better or worse, you can decide yourself, has become the party of the working class. It used to be the Democrats who were the party of the working class. Now it's the Republicans. And it's not the regular Republican Party, it's the Trumpian version of the Republican Party, which is very different from the traditional Republican Party. And Trump represents, again, whether in a positive way or a negative way, again, others can decide that. Trump represents...
Come on!
I'm not here to make partisan message. I'm not here to make partisan message.
Give us a break,
Can you hold the microphone a little closer to your mouth? Yeah.
Certainly.
That's better. Thanks.
So Trump, I think, represents that alienation. And a large part of the population who's become deeply alienated from both political parties voted for Trump. That's how I see it, and that's, you're suggesting money was a big factor?
You buy him.
I'm sorry?
He's paid for hire.
Well, you could look at it that way. I mean, the fact of the matter is, though, there are a lot of people who think that he better represents their interests than either of the mainstreams of the political parties. He's an anti-system politician, there's no doubt about that. Bernie Sanders was too, in an ironic way, and there's a significant number of people who voted for Sanders in the primary in 2016 and voted for Trump in the general. And to me, that's not surprising, since they're anti-system candidates. You know, if you want to be partisan about it, you could say perhaps Bernie Sanders represented the better angels of their nature, perhaps. But whatever value judgment you want to put on it, much of the political dysfunction we're seeing today comes directly out of these events. And the fact that people realize that their living standards have been devastated, and they're angry and bitter. And Trump nicely channels anger and bitterness, whatever else you may think of him.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would just add to what David said, that because my own work has been more on the international economy across countries, this dynamic is very familiar to almost all developed economies over the last 50 years. So the working class, particularly working class men, and the lower middle class basically have not seen any increase in their incomes and very little increase in their wealth over that period, whereas other sections of the economy have really grown and prospered, which I think is why when you look at why there is such a lack of understanding across different parts of society at the moment, this is part of it, that there's really a very large group of people who were in general fairly well educated, they prospered professionally, they gained from house prices, also a common thing in most developed economies, and they generally improved health and education outcomes. And then there's a whole equally larger swathe of the population for whom that was not the case. But you talked, David, a little bit about this being not lobbying in the traditional K Street sense, but a much deeper shift that was spurred. Could you just expand on that a little bit? What was it that business and government together did that created that shift in thinking?
Well, it was the idea that a lot of this has to do with the economic profession and sort of technical discussions in economics, and until the 70s, the dominant view was the Keynesian view. I should say, some would say it's a very conservative interpretation of Keynes, by the way. Bastard Keynesian, as some Keynesians have put it. But nevertheless, it involved some justification of government intervention in the economy and a moderation of the distribution of wealth. And that was the dominant economic theory of the 50s and 60s, represented best by Paul Samuelson of MIT. All right. Now, there'd been a fringe group at the University of Chicago, led by Friedrich von Hayek. Actually, von Hayek wasn't at Chicago, but he was part of that group. And of course, the very famous Milton Friedman, who basically argued against any kind of regulation of the economy and did not see any problem whatsoever with the idea of maldistribution of wealth. And concentration of wealth was not an issue as far as they were concerned. And they had a very sort of ideological attachment to the free market. And they had very little influence. Friedman's greatest accomplishment early on was as the economic advisor to Barry Goldwater, who had one of the greatest blowout defeats in electoral history. But then he had a rapid ascent, and the reason he had a rapid ascent is he was massively funded by business interests, particularly in finance. Finance especially liked him, but it was across the board. And it reflected their alienation of the rich with the existing state of affairs. And so where people like Friedman and von Hayek provided the brains, people in the private sector provided the money to advertise their ideas. Capitalism and Freedom, published 1962. I read it at age 17. I remember I was impressed by it, by the way, because it's very well written. Friedman's not stupid. He's an excellent arguer. And he's kind of a corporate lobbyist in a certain sense, as well as an economist, and with massive amounts of money. It was basically funding and public relations that put things like Capitalism and Friedman and von Hayek's The Road to Serfdom on the map politically. And the famous New York public relations firm Hill and Knowlton was employed to advertise their work and promote it. It's not enough to be smart, even to be brilliant. You also have to have money behind you and power behind you. And for people like Friedman had both. And it was an unbeatable combination. And it greatly magnified their ideas, and the center of economic theory moved to people like Friedman. The economics was transformed as a profession. And it was transformed as a kind of, as the handmaid of wealthy interests, basically. It was doing their bidding, more or less directly. I think this is widely recognized by many economists who said this, in fact. Paul Krugman, in a sort of almost slip of the tongue, has in passing mentioned that this is in fact what has happened. What's his name? Jagdish Bhabwade said something very similar at Columbia. And so economics basically became a kind of, despite its sort of pretense of objectivity and mathematical detachment, it's a very ideological profession. It's become more ideological over time. And it became the ideology, if you think of ideology as representing the interests of a social group, it's the interests of the very, very, very rich. And by the very rich, I mean like not even the top 1%, maybe the top 1/10 of 1%, which is where the real concentration has taken place in wealth, on a dramatic scale if you look at the data. Yeah. And so I think that's what was essentially done. You can buy political ideas. You know, they say ideas matter in politics, and they do. And you can buy ideas and promote ideas through the use of money, which is exactly what was done here.
David, I'm going to move to a few questions that relate to some of the topics that are very high profile in the politics that we face today, and think a bit about what your research tells us about this, including trade, tariffs, inflation, communications and culture. So starting just with the trade deficit. So obviously President Trump has given many different reasons for why he has announced tariffs of different types on different countries in different policy combinations. But one of his reasons has been to address the US trade deficit. Can you talk a little bit about whether that is a valid and in fact useful topic to think about, and then about the way that one might go about it?
Okay, a little bit of history here is that the United States had been, since I think 1893, a net surplus country, not a deficit country, owing to a very strong manufacturing sector and exports. This was dramatically true, of course, after World War II. The U.S. had an overwhelming dominance in trade and exports, owing to the dynamism of American industry. Now, that began to fade, of course, with deindustrialization. By 1971, the U.S. for the first time became a deficit country and has been in deficit, has mostly grown over time. Deficit means we import more than we export. And
does that include services? And
yes.
And does it account
goods and services?
And does it also account for the fact that there's U.S. subsidiaries overseas?
That's different. That's the capital account.
Yeah. That's
flows of funds. I'm talking about goods and services. All right, goods and services.
But they're interrelated, right?
Definitely. I'll get to that. Yes.
Okay.
There's the capital account and the current account. The current account is what I'm talking. That's goods and services. That's the real economy. Okay. And so what you get here basically is the U.S. became a deficit country. Mostly, in most cases, what that means, if you become a deficit country, even if you're a relatively rich country, like let us say Britain, you have to undergo austerity, which means you have to make yourself poorer, so you import less. That's the way it works. Those are the rules of economic logic here. All right. The United States uniquely did not have to do that, and the reason is the U.S. had the advantage of having the key currency, which was the dollar, and that gave us a special advantage. Plus, I go into this in my book in detail. There was a political deal that has only recently come to light that was undertaken by William Simon, who was the Treasury Secretary at the end of the Nixon presidency. And what he did is he shifted American policy suddenly a little bit, just a tiny bit, away from the Shah of Iran and towards Saudi Arabia. There's a rivalry, a long-standing rivalry between the two countries over who would be the master of the Gulf. And Saudi Arabia had these massive reserves, petrodollars. They'd been the oil prices of that period, all right? Which, by the way, contrary to popular belief, the U.S. did not. Well, the U.S. was on the receiving end, and it devastated the economy. But this was encouraged quietly by the Nixon administration as a favor to the Shah of Iran. All right, we encouraged the Shah of Iran to raise oil prices and devastate the U.S. domestic economy. What that meant, though, is the main beneficiary was Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia accumulated vast dollar reserves. Oil was priced then as it now is in dollars. They had these huge reserves of dollars. And the deal that Simon cut was that in exchange for U.S. political backing and U.S. arms sales, Saudi Arabia would take its dollar reserves and invest them in U.S. Treasury bonds over the long term. And so they became the main purchaser of U.S. Treasury bonds, plus they agreed to use their clout with smaller countries like Kuwait, UAE, Abu Dhabi, Qatar, etc., to do the same thing. And they did. And that became the process whereby it set a precedent whereby surplus countries around the world would invest their surpluses, including China later on did this as well, in U.S. Treasury bonds. And that compensated for weak U.S. exports and held up the U.S. economy and ensured the dollar remained the top currency without austerity, okay, without austerity. And this has continued over time. By the way, everyone assumed at the time this petrodollar deal would be a temporary fix. Nobody imagined it could continue for long, and it continued for 50 years. There's a question as to how long it can continue beyond, and there's always the risk surplus countries holding American Treasury bonds will lose confidence in the bonds, will dump them, and cause a crisis. And there's no doubt this is a real issue, and Trump's response to that is tariffs. The problem with tariffs, of course, is they raise costs, and they cause immense instability, and I suspect it's going to end very badly with the tariffs. There's a better way to do it, in my view, which is that John Maynard Keynes, who I've come to appreciate more and more, by the way, is having an extraordinary brilliance and very creative ideas. He proposed in 1944 a very different kind of system. You see, the system we have now, where deficit countries need to undergo austerity, that's not inevitable. None of these things are inevitable, they're choices, and that was an explicit choice that we chose that system. The alternative was proposed by Keynes, what he proposed. His idea was that a deficit is a bad thing, it's destabilizing, but a surplus is just as bad. In other words, the idea we have now is that deficit is a sign of bad policy, but a surplus is a sign of good policy. Germany, a traditional surplus country, follows good policies. Greece follows bad policies, is the idea. But what Keynes would say is both countries are following bad policies because a surplus is every bit as destabilizing as a deficit. And one causes the other. You can't have a deficit without a surplus. It's an accounting fact, all right? And he didn't like austerity as a solution because A, it puts all the burden on the deficit country, none on the surplus country. And also, the problem with austerity is it reduces growth. And he was very growth-oriented. And it reduces growth not only in the target country, but worldwide it reduces growth. It's bad for the world economy. And so he proposed a system at Bretton Woods, the great Bretton Woods agreement in 1944, he proposed that there be a system adjudicated not in the United States, a new international organization to be based in Basel, Switzerland, based on a new currency, not the dollar, to be called Bancor, managed internationally, would be the world currency. And that he wanted to have a system whereby surplus countries would be required to finance the deficits of deficit countries and correct the imbalance mutually, rather than having all the requirement fall on the deficit country. Now, the irony of this is that at the time the U.S. blocked it. Why? Because the U.S. was the biggest surplus country in the world. We didn't want to finance anybody. We wanted to call the shots, and that supports what we had.
Greedy.
I'm sorry?
We were greedy.
You could look at it as greedy. It certainly had that element. Harry Dexter White represented the Treasury Department, and he vetoed it. He was also an economist, of far less renowned than Keynes, but he represented the biggest surplus country in the world, so he could call the shots, which he did. Keynes represented a deficit country, Great Britain, at the Bretton Woods Conference, and so he was overruled, despite the fact he was the most eminent economy of the generation, 20th century, really. But I think it's a perfectly viable idea, and which should be reconsidered now. Now that the United States is itself a deficit country, maybe we should propose something like that. It should apply not only to the United States, but to other deficit countries like, let's say, Greece or Argentina. Countries that have been suffering under massive austerity that sort of wiped out decades of progress in many cases, especially in places like Latin America and Africa.
But could I just ask a question? So in the case, let's look at Argentina, for example. So it's had this chronic political and economic issue with deficits. What incentive or what in Keynes' proposal would help the Argentinians to realize that over time they had to bring their deficit into balance? Because it seems to me...
I know the problem you're describing. I don't know enough about the Argentine economy to give a detailed response to that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what he had, the idea that there should be a much more limited version of austerity to discourage profligate spending and things like that and ineffective policies, but it should be much more moderated by some degree of assistance from the surplus country, because the surplus country is every bit as much at fault in Keynes' view.
But in theory, isn't that what the World Bank and the IMF is supposed to do, although in practice?
Not really, no, because the whole idea of the current economy, as it was agreed at Bretton Woods, is all of the responsibility 100% falls on the deficit country, and the only solution to that is massive austerity. All right? Massive austerity. And the problem with massive austerity is it undercuts social capital, you cut back on education and health. It devastates the possibility for future growth. It certainly has done that in Africa. I mean, Africa is the country, the target area I know best, and it's been devastating to growth in Africa because austerity undercuts the ability of these countries to ever get out of their low level of development. Whereas Keynes' idea was a growth orientation that was global in nature. To some extent, you might say that what he wanted was a full employment economy on a global level, managed at a global level. Anyway, so that I would say basically an updated version of that should be considered. For what it's worth, briefly, in the Nixon administration, I found this in the archives, the Treasury Department was considering proposing this Keynesian idea for the world when the U.S. suddenly became a deficit country. They considered that as an option and just basically blocked it because it went against the whole free market idea that was becoming popular. But I think it's something that needs reconsideration at this point in time. It seems certainly a better solution than tariffs, which I think is going to be a disaster. There is the gains from trade that can't be denied. And the working class is also comprised of consumers, and as consumers, everybody's going to be hurt by this. And everybody, I mean, it's coming very soon, the negative effects of tariffs, that's a guarantee. And it seems like it's a very bad way to reindustrialize as well. I don't see anything particularly positive about that coming myself.
Just to add a thought to Philip's question, I think there was a proposal after COVID that there be a really massive shift in special drawing rights of the IMF, but not only to be used for balance of payments and crisis support, also to be used for long-term investment, including pro-climate investment. And that proposal was made at a time when the surplus countries actually dramatically increased their reserves. Over 2020 and 2021, countries like Switzerland, their reserves increased enormously. Long-term investment, including pro-climate investment. And that proposal was made at a time when the surplus countries actually dramatically increased their reserves. Over 2020 and 2021, countries like Switzerland, their reserves increased enormously. So there was sufficient was funds available basically to think about that sort of coordinated approach. So I think the takeaway, if I'm thinking here, David, of what you were saying, is that talking about trade deficits is not in itself an invalid thing. Thinking about surpluses and deficits equally as potentially being destabilizing may be a good way to shift the mindset about that. And also that we should think, you didn't say this, but I think it's very much in part of the book, that shifts in trade and tariffs very much hit some communities more than others. Paying for consistent trade deficits by importing capital because other countries are buying your treasury bills, because people are investing in your economy, also benefits different sectors. So the impact is not the same on everyone within the country.
Can I add a few points on that? One of the things I found most significant, actually, was what I call financialization, which is the reorientation of the U.S. economy away from manufacturing and towards finance. The way it was put in the Treasury Department, the U.S. was becoming less of an industrial superpower and more of a financial superpower. And the rates of profit in finance became dramatically more attractive over time, which is what we have today. And the problem with financialization is very few people are employed in finance. Most of them are highly trained, high income. And it's not like manufacturing. And it contributed dramatically to, I think that was more than any other factor, the contribution to deindustrialization in the United States was financialization. And that its origins very much in the 70s. And it began with, again, that was a policy choice. Keynes, by the way, was very critical of finance. He wanted to restrain finance. And he actually wanted, if you look at the general theory and the final chapter, he basically talks about the state being the main source of investment and planning around full employment. People leave that out basically when they discuss when I read Samuelson's Introduction to Economics as a college freshman, they leave that part out of Keynes. What he wanted to do basically is make the private financial sector irrelevant. He talked about euthanasia of the financier. And by euthanasia, I don't think he meant putting them up against the wall and shooting them. I think it was much more, what his idea was basically to make that to retire them, pack them off to Florida to play cards on the beach. And that's a bit, I mean, it's not like shooting them anyway. And so basically, I think, the reason he felt that way was partly because he saw finance in and of itself didn't really contribute that much to the economy, it greased the wheels. But it wasn't in and in itself. And what he was afraid of is what we have today, which is speculation becomes one of the main sources of investment, one of the main sources of profit. And also the talent basically goes there, as is well known. It's got a lot of attention around the 2008 crash. Hundreds of people with PhDs in physics and math and engineering went to Wall Street. Why? Because there's a lot of money in finance. That's why. So you had very talented people spinning their wheels, which in Keynes's view produced nothing productive. And so Keynes wanted to restrain finance. That was very important to him. And to some extent, the existing system did put restraints on finance. There was a joke during the 60s that banks operated on a, 363 principle. You lend out in deposits at 3% interest. 3% interest on deposits, 6% basically on loans, and then head to the golf courses no later than 3 p.m. Okay? And the implications is banks basically weren't that important to the economy. All right, the stock market, by the way, did not recover its 1929 level until 1959. All right, even as the economy boomed, the real economy boomed. All right. And the stock market remained in depression for decades. And so basically, that was the economy you had, and the restraints that were imposed by the New Deal were lifted. The first restraint that was lifted was at the international level. Exchange rates, international exchange rates were regulated under the Bretton Woods system by the IMF. The original function of the IMF was that countries agreed not to change their exchange rates, not to lower. The exchange rate is the value of one currency against another. And devalue means your currency is worth less against the dollar. Revalue means it becomes more valuable against the dollar, is what it means. And you were not allowed to change the exchange rate more than, I think, 1% at any given time without permission from the IMF. Wanted a fundamental revision of exchange rate You had to put it before the economists at the IMF would evaluate it in technical terms if it was desirable. And the idea was to put shackles on the financial sector, is the idea. There were also a cluster of New Deal regulations in the United States that prevented extensive activity by finance, particularly the Glass-Steagall Act. There are other things, Regulation Q of the Federal Reserve, a series of other factors. For a variety of reasons, this did begin to unravel. The short version of this is Britain deregulated their financial sector in London, in the city of London, to restore the city to its former glory, I guess, even as Britain was becoming going from being the greatest power on earth to just being a small island off the coast of France. They wanted to... I'm sorry.
No response?
My apologies. Anyway, and they made up for it basically by deregulating their financial sector. And this helped to basically led to what was called the euro market, which led to incipient speculation, a return to speculation. And the bottom line is the Nixon administration, also behind the scenes, with people like Milton Friedman, always detested the Bretton Woods Agreement as regulation. He hated regulation. And so he wanted an elimination of what's called the fixed exchange rate system, moving to floating exchange rates. He's deregulated the whole system. That's what he wanted. And basically, he used the crisis of the early 70s as a pretext to do it. And this was the first round of financial deregulation, was eliminating fixed exchange rates, which happened in 1973. It was the fulfillment of the desire of Friedman and his acolytes, which was implemented in 73 by the Nixon administration. It was actually a brilliant place to start. You know why? Nobody knew a goddamn thing about exchange rates. Okay, even now when I talk about exchange rates, I see the light go. I see the light go out in people's eyes. You know, it's like, and nobody knows anything about exchange rates. So it was the perfect place to start, because just a few specialized economists could lobby, and led by Milton, not by Friedman himself, but a number of his acolytes who were in the Treasury Department. And they were able to implement this sort of almost without people even noticing. And that was the beginning, basically, of a massive increase in the financial sector. And it was followed by deregulation of domestic exchange rates, which took place under Carter. And then round after round after round of deregulation. It got the ball rolling in 73, all right? And so financialization meant it was much easier to make money, and fast money, by just investing in speculation than investing in factories, which only paid off over decades. And you could make quick bucks, and there was a much shortening of the time horizon. There was one more beautiful thing about financialization, which was this, which is too big to fail, all right? If you invest, of course, you could win or you could lose. It's a profit and loss system. But you see, if a big bank loses, there's a danger of what's called systemic risk. Risk could take down the whole financial sector, the whole economy. That's what happened in the Great Depression. And so as a result of that, if a big bank fails, it gets bailed out, which happened almost immediately after the 73 deregulation. The Franklin National Bank and then the Herstatt Bank in Germany lost money on speculation, and they were bailed out by the Bundesbank and the Fed.
In 2008.
Well, you had round after round after round. Of course, the big one was 2008. The really big one was 2008. And Friedman decried this, and he said, I never intended for this to happen. I'm totally against bailouts. But he created a system that guaranteed bailouts, is what he did. Friedman, by the way, had the brilliant idea of never accepting any official governmental position, Treasury Secretary. He never did that because that would mean accountability, and he was not into accountability. I can't blame him. I don't like accountability either. But nevertheless, that's the way it worked. And so financialization, I think, is a very underrated factor in deindustrialization and the whole dilemma. It also meant a reorientation of capitalism in the sense that the center of power moved from industry to finance. Except for one area, which is high technology, because the one area where the U.S. remains superior in manufacturing was in technology, and there's a reason for that, which is the military-industrial complex. The U.S. had by far the biggest military on the planet, as it does today. There's one area we still lead unquestionably, and that's military spending. China, Russia, nowhere near what we have, all right? And they were the main sources of innovation, because that's where most of the R&D went, was military-related. And that's the basis of microelectronics, of IT. All of that comes from the military. Elon Musk might imagine he created all these space things. They all came from the military. They were heavily subsidized by taxpayers. And also the fact basically closely related to that is, until today, it's changing very fast now, but I mean, the excellence of America's universities. Places like Stanford, basically, that helped power Silicon Valley, or MIT, basically, which powered biotechnology in the Boston area. This is all going to change now. It's all changing. But until now, so you had some unique niche areas where America remained technologically superior, but most areas, of course, we lost our industry and went to finance. And that was good if you were in finance. It was basically bad for just about everybody else. Yeah, Bill has a question.
Talk about the decline of unions, particularly in the private sector. They've just been virtually wiped out on.
Okay.
Yeah.
One of the innovations, of course, was that the New Deal, was that it helped empower unions and create. I think the high point of unions was after World War II and into the 50s under Eisenhower. Sorry, unions achieved, I think, 35% of the workforce was unionized. I think from the late 40s into the mid 50s. Deunionization began, and deindustrialization actually began earlier than people think. It began after the '58 recession. It began, but just at an incipient level. It really got going in the 70s, but it did begin earlier than people think. And but by the 70s, it was 25%, and it was big enough to first of all be a player at the policy level, at least in the Democratic Party, a player of consequence. And people did consult unions. Most major papers had a union reporter, had a labor reporter, and they were part of the power structure. Was the major unions, especially the AFL-CIO, and they also had a very important role in that, for all their flaws, and there were many flaws in the unions. I can go into that. They did act as a brake on reduction of wages. That the whole idea was that under inflation, we should lower wages because that would crush consumption and stop inflation. That's the way it's supposed to work. Now, you might say, if you want to be a moralist about it, that's unfair because that puts all the burden on the working classes, but that's the way austerity is supposed to work. And but the unions prevented that. And one of the reasons you had the revolt of the rich was to get rid of unions, so that we could basically put all the burden of austerity on them and correct inflation on the backs of the working classes, which is exactly what happened. And part and parcel of that was of course, getting rid of the unions, which for the most part is exactly what we've done. Unions today are 10%, mostly in the public sector, and they decline every year. There's a lot of talk about reunionization, especially in the Democratic Party. Mostly it's a mirage. If you look at the data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, it goes down every year. And most of the unionization we've had, I'm a member of a union, by the way, a factory union, are people like me, which are people with college degrees. The economists call it the gentrification of the union movement, right? You do not have it among people without college degrees. It's been especially dramatic among people without college degrees. In other words, the people who need it most are getting it the least. And the overall trajectory is down, all right? And that's not stopping. And I think, again, that's not by accident, that's by design. This was explicitly a policy objective in the 1970s, was to get rid of the unions as much as possible. For the most part, they've accomplished that. And it's had a very dramatic effect because, the recent inflation, basically, has functioned very differently from how it did in the 70s. And that basically wages do not keep up with inflation. And basically it was the poor who were hurt the most. And so the current inflation, people tend to see inflation of the 70s through the eyes of what's happening now, but it functioned very differently in the 70s from how it works now. And the reason was unions, which for the most part are gone.
And are wages keeping up with the increased productivity? Or is
no, quite the opposite.
Exactly.
Again, one of the things you have
more important.
On the very first page of my book, what I show is a chart of productivity and wages, and it's very dramatic. What you have is, from the late 40s onward, you have, first of all, high rates of growth in productivity, and productivity is probably the most important indicator of economic health.
Absolutely.
It's a measure of efficiency, of a production. It's actually not a perfect measure. I can go into some of the flaws, but it's the best measure we have. It was going up rapidly, all right? And it indicated a healthy economy. What's dramatic about it is wages kept up with it almost perfectly for decades. And it was actually incorporated into a lot of industrial agreements. There was what was called the Treaty of Detroit in 1950, where GM agreed with United Auto Workers that as a part of a formal agreement, wages would go up in tandem with productivity rates. And that became a model for workplaces across the country, the Detroit arrangement. And you can see it in the data. It actually worked. And then in the 70s, this is 3 phases. The first phase was the happy years, which is productivity goes up, wages go up. Then in the 70s, you had a crisis, and productivity was mostly flat. There was very little growth in productivity. And wages were pretty flat, but again, they kept up with productivity. Then after 1980, I should say after 1982, productivity finally starts growing after the recession, the terrible recession of 80 to 82 is over. And productivity goes up, not as fast as it did in the earlier period, by the way, but it goes up. And then wages, first of all, wages go down for 25 years.
Yep.
And then they go up a little bit, mostly because women start entering the workforce, and this is mostly female wages. You know, again, we clap, and is that a good thing or a bad thing is debatable, because a lot of this, there's a positive and a negative. You had women for the first time were able to become doctors, lawyers, professors, astronauts even. And you know, it's obviously very satisfying, exciting professions. Most women didn't go into these professions. They became things like clerks at Walmart, all right, which were not so exciting. And I suspect a lot of the women who went into the workforce, if they were given a choice, said, do you want to work or not? They would say, no, I prefer to stay on with the kids. And if they have to work at Walmart, well, I can see why, right? So we shouldn't applaud too much about the entry of women into the workforce, because it was a double-edged sword. And I'm not sure all of the women who entered the workforce were thrilled about it. But the fact is to the extent there was a little growth in wages, it was almost entirely female wages. Male wages remained depressed up to the present day. They are lower today than they were 50 years ago.
1970.
Yeah.
So it's a perfect segue to my last question, David, and then I'm going to throw open so we take more comments and questions from others in the audience. But this is on the role of culture, identity, and communication, and explaining the Republican and Democrat
Good.
successes and failures electorally over the last period.
Okay. Well, one of the problems that the Revolt of the Rich had, I have to say, one of the things that very impressed me, and I've gone through the private papers of these people over years, is that the right hired political theorists and strategists who were absolutely brilliant. I mean, much better, head and shoulders better than anybody on the left, without question. I was extremely impressed with their skill level and their flexibility. And they planned out their lobbying efforts almost like generals planning a military offensive. I mean, with that level of discipline. Something the left never does, by the way. One of the things that they said, and they said this themselves, and the person I'm referring to particularly is Paul Weyrich. He'll found the Heritage Foundation. He's also the person who created the moral majority, for those of you who remember the moral majority. He himself wasn't that religious, but he saw religion as a useful vehicle for what he wanted to do. And he was funded very heavily by the Scaife Mellon interests, which were the heavies, the corporate heavies of the decade, also the Coors Beer interest. And what he said is this, he said, we tried going into working class and middle class neighborhoods and talking about cutting taxes on business, and people hated that, and so we just dropped it. We didn't do that anymore. And so we just dropped all talk about economics. And instead what we did is we focused on culture, because that really got people interested. And in particular, the 70s was a period of an upsurge of evangelical Christianity. It was what was called America's fourth great awakening. America is an unusual country, and that among rich countries, typically, we studied this when I was in graduate school, the anomaly. In rich countries, overwhelmingly, as they become more educated, more urban, higher income, they drop religion. The extreme case is Scandinavia, right? Post-religious almost, right? The United States is an anomaly in that it's high income, high education, highly urbanized, and very religious, all right? And we go through periodic cycles of upsurges of evangelical Christianity. But evangelical Christianity, I mean, mostly literalist interpretations of the New Testament, all right? And, you know, I have to say, it was difficult to study because at a gut level I don't understand it. I'm not Christian, and but I try not to make value judgments about other people's religion, so I'll leave that out and just basically go with the facts here. We had a massive upsurge of evangelical Christianity, all right? And it was mostly, at least some of it was a reaction to the changes of the 1960s. Abortion rights and homosexuality, nudity in films, drugs, all those things, predictable things, all right? And so what Paul Weyrich, the brilliant idea he had was to do this. Was first of all to encourage his corporate friends to pour money into evangelical Christianity to increase their punching power and to link them up with free market economics, all right? And to get ministers to preach not only Jesus Christ and to oppose sinful things like abortion rights, but also to oppose unions and government regulation. And Jerry Falwell, who was heavily supported, who was very close to, he's a very prominent minister, as everybody knows, became the dominant figure in evangelical Christianity at the end of the 70s. He would talk about how the new market economics, okay? And he mixed references from the scripture to Milton Friedman. And I guess Milton Friedman became almost part of scripture. All right, even though I think Milton Friedman is an atheistic Jew, but leave that aside. And it was very effective. And you got what was called fusionism. And the idea of fusionism was a big tent to bring in business conservatives who really ran the show, cultural conservatives and religious conservatives, and also militarists. The military-industrial complex, for a variety of reasons, was also mobilizing heavily during this period, and knit them all together in a united front to build a majority. They were after a majority. And people like Weyrich openly said he learned from the left, because the left, the old left, focused upon mass movements. And he said, we want to demobilize the union movement and build up a whole new mass movement around evangelical Christianity, which was huge. It was enormous. You could say the mass movement of the right, the cultural version of it, was one of the biggest mass movements. The biggest mass movement of this period, of the decade, was not on the left. It was not identity politics. It was not feminism. All right? It was evangelical Christianity. All right? And that was very heavily linked up with free market economics. And it solved the problem because there weren't enough, elites aren't big by definition. Okay? The 1/10 of 1%, we're talking a tiny number of people here. Right? Not enough votes. And so they got a big majority. And it was through cultural conservatism that did that. And it really owes to the authentic genius of people like Weyrich. All right? And what's very striking, I might add, on the left, they didn't do strategy. The left just basically took it to this. It seems the left is very reactive. Whatever the crowd wants to defund the police, we'll defund the police. It never mattered if the polls show people hate it. And the right never does that. The right acts strategically. What's going to create a majority? And also they self-correct. When they try something that doesn't work, they drop it and they do something else. The left never does that. We double down on effective policy. We always double down. And we demonize people who criticize it. The right doesn't do that. The right acts strategically. And naturally the right wins every time. Anyway, so that's how I would see it. And to the present day, the culture wars, of course, have reached incredibly important levels. I'm very impressed how everything is seen through including foreign policy, is seen through the lens of the culture wars. Anyway, so here we are. Yeah.
Questions, please.
Yeah,
stop.
so what you're sort of also saying, though, is that as the tariffs and whatever policies Trump is sort of enacting, it later, at some point, this is going to come back because the people at the bottom are going to be really crippled. And so at what point do people then say it's not about culture, it's about eggs? And that this guy is ripping us off, and is there then room, one, for some change, and not necessarily Democrats, but another party? Where do you see this fever breaking? It cannot go on at this, or can it?
I think the good news is that if you read the New York Times, you get the impression nothing ever changes. And people say it's going to change. And it says, nothing ever changes. They said that about Trump. Trump is a brand new figure. Nobody would have imagined he would ever be president. Nobody imagined he would ever be president like this. The good news is it's a reminder that we have surprises in history. All right? Trump is a surprise.
Oh, yeah.
I guess in a sense he's a surprise because I think for a long time I've expected we're going to get a demagogue like this. I think a lot of people did. But if you read the New York Times, oh no. I read The Economist, they're the same thing. And but history has its surprises. And they could be bad and they could be good. It depends. And so I think people are overstating when they say we'll never have another party. Because things change. You can very suddenly get very, very dramatic political shifts that you never imagined were possible. And so I would not rule out a breakdown of the party system. What we are seeing now is a political sclerosis. in the sense that on the one hand, Trump is, people see Trump as the revolution they've wanted. In a sense, he is a revolution, if you want to use that term, and that he's very different from what we had before. He basically is broken with the establishment of both parties. Reorient, certainly the rhetoric of politics has dramatically changed, whether for better or worse, again, only for others to decide. But his policies, I do think, are bound to fail. I can't imagine the tariffs are going to work. I don't see how that's going to work well. Also, there's an amateurism that's really mind-boggling. I mean, his tendency, even with the tariffs, to change things from day to day, which is terrible economically, because investment hates uncertainty, which is what we're getting on a dramatic level. I don't see Trump succeeding in the long term or even in the short term. The problem is the Democrats are incredibly weak, extremely unpopular if you look at the public opinion polls. I should add expert opinion has been devastated. Up to a point, I can understand it. I'm a professor, and people hate professors, and I know that, right? And I understand why they hate professors. And they hate expert opinion, the mass media. Nobody trusts the legacy media. And there's a reason for it, which is you have the experts, the national security experts, brought us to the war on terror, which would be a wonderful thing. Didn't go so well, did it? All right? Didn't go so well. In Iraq and Afghanistan, didn't go well at all. The financial geniuses brought us financial deregulation. In 2008, that led to the worst blowout since the Great Depression. Right? So you've had one failure after another by the experts. So one can go on and on. And so people don't trust experts. They throw out the baby with the bathwater and they say, vaccines are ridiculous and the moon landings were faked, and they go overboard. And they do go overboard. But there's a kernel of truth in this, which is the experts have screwed up. Not once, but again and again. With what most impresses me is there's no accountability. The people who fail move up. There's never any discrediting of people who failed. The people who brought us to Iraq, Afghanistan, the Libya overthrow, they moved up in the foreign policy establishment. Or people who advocated deregulation, there have been no prosecutions. Charles Kindleberger, the great economic historian at MIT, pointed out in every financial blowout, there's always revelation of financial corruption and illegality. And usually the prosecutions. There were no significant prosecutions after 2008. Right? Where you look forward, not backward. Well, that went really well. And it embittered the public. And so I think what you're getting here is a public really that wants something different, that Trump is different. And that's one of the reasons, there's no doubt that was one of the feelings behind Bernie Sanders, was that he was an outsider. He was an anti-system figure, and people wanted an anti-system figure, whether it be Trump or Bernie Sanders. And but the bottom line is the two-party system is stringing us up by our ankles, shall we say, in the sense that both parties are deeply unpopular. I think Trump was never popular. He barely broke 50% popularity when he was elected, and now he's below 50%, and I suspect he'll just go down, down, down as the economy goes down. I just don't see the Democrats offering much of an alternative because nobody trusts the Democrats. There's one more thing, which is the cultural issues. I'm amazed, basically, the Democrats keep sticking by deeply unpopular cultural issues. Again, people can draw their own opinions on this. I'll just point out the obvious. Things like, polls are very clear. Things like transgenders in girls' sports is extremely unpopular with the public. All right. Things like puberty blockers for minors is extremely unpopular with the public. And I'm absolutely astounded by the fact that the Democrats are sticking with these issues, which are basically clearly contributing to their unpopularity. And I just don't see that changing because there's such a religious conviction about these things. And again, I'm not saying you should agree or disagree with these things. I'm just pointing out the fact that they're unpopular. And this will, in fact, this has reduced the popularity of the Democratic Party. Also, something else. The Democrats have become deeply intertwined with elite academia. It's a very dramatic fact, by the way. From 1988 till 2016, every single Democratic nominee, without exception, has had a degree from either Harvard or Yale. All right, Harvard or Yale. All right, and that's incredible. And people hate Harvard and Yale. They really do. So I think that one of the problems you do have, the Democrats have become the party of educated elites. And there just aren't enough of them to win elections, is the problem. And the Democrats, I'm sorry, I keep
You're just
going.
going to stop so we can keep,
I'm sorry.
we can keep
Okay.
the streaming going.
I
Just for
apologize.
Ready? So I have a question at the back, and then...
Agree with almost everything you say, except the...
You speak real loud, real loud.
What's that?
Speak real loud.
Speak up.
Okay, so,
I can give him the microphone.
that's all right, I can speak loud. I agree with almost everything you said, except for the thing about the experts. The problem is the press goes to the high-level experts, and the Iraq war is a perfect example. And Mike Ritter, the people there who went to Pulitzer Prize, went to the people who were actually experts, not the people at the top. And you can see that everywhere, in financial crisis, everywhere. The press always goes to the same people. And they almost, it's like they're taking dictation.
Well, I agree. It's true. Obviously, it's
Question on
selective.
your, should we take a couple, Dave?
Oh,
Because
yeah,
I know I
that's
had
a
a
good
lot of
idea.
people who
That's a good
wanted
idea. That's a good
to
idea.
make a question on your right, Liv, just here. Yes, exactly.
I think that a lot of us here are from Democratic clubs, and so we, work in the Democratic Party as volunteers. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts about our strategy going forward, aside from this idea of a third party starting and kind of putting that to the side, but what you think the Democratic Party should do, as opposed to what it shouldn't do. I mean, I think your critique across the board has been very valid, but I still think that we need a way to go forward. And as, some have argued that Trump is going to collapse with the economy, and maybe we should just wait for him to implode and then act. But still, when he does hopefully implode, we're going to have a strategy going forward. So I'd like to hear your ideas about that.
Should we take just one more question up here at the back and then come back and then other questions from over here?
I'd like to speak in defense of Jimmy Carter. You mentioned some of the things that were rolling in the Nixon administration, and of course, I think an argument could be made that it was really Reagan by breaking up their traffic controllers union, deregulating the savings and loan industry, a couple other things that I just forgot. It was really Reagan that got this game going. And what say you?
Do you want to, I don't care if I respond now?
Yes,
okay.
please.
All right. I'll address the last question. Let me say that it's difficult to discuss Carter because I'm very impressed with his post-presidency. All right? I served in the Peace Corps of West Africa, and I remember there was a disease called dracunculiasis, guinea worm disease, which is all over West Africa. I think the number of cases today is under 50 worldwide, and that's mostly because of Carter. So there's no question he's had dramatic, very impressive accomplishments in his post-presidency. And I think he actually, there were a number of times he said things that strongly implied he deeply regrets a lot of what he did as president that concentrated wealth and regrets the effects of it. But unfortunately, having gone through his personal papers at the Carter Library in Atlanta, also the personal papers of one of his chief economic advisors, Alfred Kahn at Cornell, I have to say, he more than Reagan is responsible for the concentration of wealth, more than any other president. I think he meant well, but that was what he did. And I'll be very specific about this. Alfred Kahn was his main advisor on deregulation, beginning with deregulation of airlines, and his advisor on inflation. And in his personal papers, Alfred Kahn openly said what he wanted to do was destroy unions. That was one of his main objectives. He had a quote, I'm quoting him almost directly. What I'd love to see, he said, is the auto workers to be worse off. I'd love to see the truckers to be worse off. All right? While he simultaneously expressed deep compassion, and emphasized compassion, for suffering elite interests in business, all right? Who are suffering under regulation. Deregulation, by the way, could have had a positive effect because it can raise productivity. The problem was it was done simultaneously with ending basically antitrust, which was also on the neoliberal agenda. And so what happened is he deregulated airlines, and then without any antitrust enforcement, the airlines just consolidated and through monopoly pricing raised ticket prices. Yes. And studies show there was no decline in ticket prices over the next 50 years, contrary to popular mythology. Northwestern economist Robert Gordon documented this in his long book on U.S. economic history, The Rise and Fall of American Growth. And at the same time, it did two things. First of all, it reduced wages in the airline industry and set precedent for further rounds of deregulation in trucking, in rail, all of which occurred under Carter, which further dramatically reduced wages. And finally, financial deregulation, which under Carter, which dramatically increased financialization, which denuded industry. And all of that crushed unions as well. which was what Alfred Kahn set out to do, and he said so. There was intentionality here, all right? And Paul Volcker, whom Carter appointed to the Fed, was loved by the financial industry. They called him Mr. Wonderful, all right? Since the 1930s, the double-dip recession of 1980 to 1982, he was reappointed by Reagan, showing authentic bipartisanship. And he also said that crushing unions was something he wanted to do. He was a nominal Democrat, but obviously an anti-union Democrat. The change in tax law, that the eliminating or reducing the progressivity of taxation, that began with the 1978 Revenue Act. Barron's basically was enthusiastic. He said this is the best tax legislation we've seen in decades. That was Carter who signed that. I can go on and on. One thing after another. All the major events in economics and also in foreign policy, the dramatic increase in military spending, all of that we attribute to Reagan actually began under Carter. Reagan, I think, gets the credit or infamy, depending on your point of view, for these things because he was a proud free marketeer. And he used very ideological rhetoric in his speeches, whereas Carter never did that. He used the language of sacrifice and mutual burden and so on, so to some extent with a slightly religious overtone, which is natural given his background. But he did not use free market language, even if in private a lot of his aides did. But it was the same policy. Anyway, I'm sorry. Okay, I'm going on too long. My apologies.
No, don't worry, David. I was actually going to point you to the second question, because I know, by the way, that you have to leave quite sharply after we finish tonight, so I want to make sure that we have another round of questions.
What was the other question?
The question is a really key one, which is, there is a great prospect of a crisis in this administration.
Good.
What would be the political strategy and the governing strategy if that crisis happened a month from now for the Democratic Party?
I'll speak about the Democratic Party and also the activist left, which is honestly where I come out of, but also has become linked to the hip to the Democratic Party, whether for better or worse. It's almost like the youth wing of the Democratic Party these days. I think we have a number of issues here. One of them is identity politics, what's called the emphasis on gender, race, and sexuality, with the emphasis upon academic style language, has devastated the Democratic Party. I'll say that very frankly. And all the polling on that is very, 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 very clear. I'll refer you to Rui Teixeira, whose politics I don't like, but who knows his numbers, and he hammers away at this, as how basically identity politics has absolutely undermined popular support for the Democratic Party, and everybody but people with advanced degrees, basically, right? Democrats used to be the party of the working class, but that's completely changed, dramatically changed. And it's largely due to these cultural issues, and it's amazing how the Democrats stick with them, despite the fact that they're so obviously devastating the party. It's incredible. What I'm referring to here is it's so easy to change, like if you could just stop using words like intersectionality or cisgender normativities, all right? It's horrible. Latinx, okay? I'll tell you, I'm from Arizona, which is overwhelming. I think it's now almost 50% Mexican-American. And Latinos hate the term Latinx. They never use it, okay? But the Democratic Party always uses it. BIPOC for African-Americans. Who would thought of a phrase like BIPOC? But the Democrats keep using it. And so I think dropping these hideous phrases, which come out of academia, by the way, people like me think them up, my colleagues anyway, that really is one of the things that's hobbling the party, and that really has to go. I think one of the problems we have here is the model the Democrats have, and the activist left even more has, is you always have to recreate the 60s and recreate the 70s. And maybe the better model is maybe, how about the 30s? All right, maybe the 30s is the better model if you want a historical precedent. Class, right? Emphasis on class and people's economic needs. All right, might be a place to start. Okay, if you want to start looking at historical precedents, maybe study the 30s or the 40s, the early 40s before McCarthy killed the whole thing. But and Herbert Hoover, also Truman actually. But in any case, so that's on the economic front. One of the problems we have is that. There were things done, there were some baby steps away from neoliberalism under Biden. And the problem was that a lot of these projects didn't basically happen fast enough. And they may play out over decades, and over decades they may produce positive results. but they take too long. And this has become a major discussion in the Democratic Party. Ezra Klein has discussed in abundance. I haven't read the book, honestly, but I've seen discussions of it. And much of the discussion coming out of that book is that the bureaucratic process of getting, let's put it this way. In 1934, I think, Roosevelt declared we're going to have a WPA, and within months you had a WPA up and running. And people were employed across the country, and it raised wages. But Biden declared, well, Obama declared earlier on, we'll have high-speed rail in California. And today, it was legislated, it was funded, and no high-speed rail over a decade after it was legislated. All right? Was it government-supported internet in rural areas? Where did that happen? Nothing happened. And there's so many projects that are legislated but never happen, and clearly we have a problem. The Republicans, let me say again, without endorsing Elon Musk, because I don't endorse people to be, obviously Elon Musk has done a lot of very negative things, but there's a kernel of truth there, which is that there is a problem of efficiency. You can't run an economy or government programs without efficiency. You can't get around that, all right? But so we need, until we can correct that problem, we need policies that will help people fast. And one of those could be changes in tax policy, which is tax cuts for people at the lower level, or maybe just cash grants to people at a certain income level. It's better if it be universal in my view, but universal meaning, people at the lower level pay less taxes. Progressive taxation. People bear in mind the nominal rate of taxation under Eisenhower was 91% at the top. 91%, right? AOC proposed 70%, and she was called a communist for that. Well, I guess basically Eisenhower must have been even more of a communist. McCarthy said he was. Maybe McCarthy was right. Anyway, in any case, taxation would be a good way to do it fast. Another thing that could be done. What's that?
Painless.
Painless. That's right. And so these big government programs where you help people. The problem is, until we can correct the problem of inefficiency of putting them out there, we need something to happen fast. And I think taxation policy that puts money in people's pockets and does it quickly, and basically advertises that we're doing it. I mean, the Republicans, Trump would put his name on the thing. We should, put the
stimulus check.
Yeah, that's right.
Sharpie, yeah, he signed
that's
Sharpie.
a great idea. I mean, I credit Trump with having a good idea there. The Democrats might think about doing things like that. So I think the problem is you can't say we're doing things that'll help people 10 years from now. As Keynes said, in the long run, we're all dead. All right, the long run is no good. It has to be done in the short run. All right, have to
In
be.
the long run, we're all Keynesians.
Anyway, so that for what it's worth, that's my 2 cents.
I think that there is a huge debate to be had within the party about what are the fast confidence building measures. So David talked also about loss of confidence. What are measures that would build confidence if there was a crisis and there was then a chance for the Democratic Party to be in American? Coming over here for last round of questions or comments.
Well, I have one question. Part of the problem, I agree with you completely on difficulties with the financialization. When the president of Lehman Brothers was called to the Senate to explain why the firm had gone bust, he could not explain the tools, the financial tools that the firm used. And that, to me, suggests that they were playing roulette with the money and that this had become a totally irresponsible game. But the main point is the following. How realistic is it to re-industrialize the US at this point? Because that is a typical example of a long-term project. And in the short term, I don't think that there is any prospect for this. So Trump can say that he wants to bring coal back. Even that would be difficult, quite apart from the horrible effects on the environment. But if the solution is reindustrialization, how to achieve this in a temporal horizon that is manageable and short enough?
My
Any
understanding.
other, can I just ask David any last questions, because then
Fair
I'll
enough,
come
fair
back to you,
Okay,
and then we'll
fair
hand
enough.
to Neve to close. Philip, just in front.
Just one comment, which
Please.
is that Latin America, from about 1940 to about 1990, implemented something called import substitution development. And the big policy there was high tariffs.
Right.
And I was actually in Mexico as a 13-year-old boy.
Mhm.
And I had a Minolta camera that my dad had bought me for $90 from Japan. And I was living with a family, and my Mexican brother offered me $180 for that camera. And I was, 13-year-old, confused, a dad's present, but I finally sold it to him, I think for less than $180, because I didn't understand it. And I spent the next 15 years of my life trying to understand that. And I would just suggest to you that what Trump is doing is exactly the same mistake that the Latin American countries are doing. They create these high tariff barriers with the expectation that you're going to create Minolta cameras in the United States or in Mexico.
As an
And
import substitution.
it doesn't work.
Like a
And
vacuum.
over the long term, you create a political economy which perverts a more democratic political economy, which we're seeing already happening with the tech bros and their influence on the political economy. So I would suggest to the Democratic Party that, maybe this is my Reed College background as a Marxist. The time is approaching where the social and political and economic conditions are ripening for a revolution of the left. And the false sort of consciousness of Trump and all the neoliberals may well fall away. And I think that that's what we need to be prepared for, is a much more radical critique of American capitalism than the Democratic Party has been prepared to present for the last 50 years.
Move on to this one, and then honestly, I forgot.
Manufacturing and
Okay.
import substitution,
yeah.
and a complete transformation of the.
I guess import substitution industrialization, as I understand it, some of the East Asian tigers, they used to be called, like South Korea and Taiwan, they didn't call it ISI, but they followed policies not that dissimilar from ISI, with much greater success. So it is kind of a mixed legacy. They had high tariffs, if I'm not mistaken.
Right.
Infant industries.
They did, but even Korea, Japan, all of those countries were small. So
Korea's
that
not that
the
small.
only way for a small country to develop internationally is to have a very large export base. But it's
And they
theory-
did do export-led in
yeah,
general.
yeah.
My theory on that was one of the reasons they were more successful is that the principal hot wars of the Cold War were fought in Asia. And so you had massive U.S. foreign aid and also military bases, which are essentially foreign aid when you look at the effects of it. And so they were heavily subsidized. And that made it a lot easier for them to do this with success, whereas Latin America was less subsidized. I'm sure there was much more complicated factors involved. That certainly was one factor. But anyway, I don't know if it's maybe not the main topic. So I do want to note that I can see all sorts of flaws in Trump's tariffs, and I doubt it's going to produce anything positive. Again, the problem is when people tire of Trump, will the Democrats offer anything not only better but also more convincing to the public, which doesn't trust them? And that's the big question, and I don't really know the answer to that. But you were talking about the issue of reindustrialization, and to what extent is that feasible? And that's a question I'm not fully prepared to answer. My guess, I like the idea in theory of what had been termed the Green New Deal, which is energy transition to accommodate the issue of climate change and maybe to some extent at least reduce climate change if that's possible, accompanied by full employment. Unfortunately, the way it was presented to the public was a lot more green than New Deal. All right, that was the main emphasized part. And so when most working class people look at things like environmentalism, they think loss of jobs. When they see high levels of pollution, they think high levels of output and high wages. And that's very strongly, even now, I think that's how people look at it. And there's some truth to that. And when you get people talking about degrowth on the left, I have to be frank, that's an utterly mindless thing to do, because that's a great way to get people to really dislike you and make you unpopular. And that's a loser. That's a loser, politically speaking. So you have to have some. The bottom line is to reconfigure the economy to sustainability will require not years but decades of growth to lay the infrastructure if we do it properly. And so that could be the basis of a full employment Keynesian economy with great benefits to working people. To the extent that that can be politically achieved, and the issue is, I think that would require that would require a fundamental break with neoliberalism of a sort that I don't think the Democrats are ready for, at least not yet. And the elites are certainly not ready for it. The donor class is not ready for it. So I think we're going to get a lot of conflict over that issue. But to the extent, basically, that the issue of reindustrialization would come up, it would have to be, you'd have to have essentially something like a planning ministry. Like in Japan, they have the Ministry of Industry, but MITI, I forget what that stands for. Or in France, they used to have something called the Commissariat du Plan, which is the same thing in France. We need something like that, a mechanism that basically is staffed by economists who can study, where to direct state investments, basically. It's not as simple as just raising tariffs. Trump has this magical view of tariffs, which isn't going to work. But anyway, so that's my 2 cents as to where we could go with this. In principle, the Green New Deal is actually a great idea. It would have to be combined green with New Deal, which means full employment. And again, it would have to be state-led. Along lines Keynes advocated. That was what Keynes actually advocated, was the state should become the main planner and also the main source of investment as the financial sector goes out of business.
I'm so sorry, but I'm going to have to summarize, because I know that David has to leave, and then I'm going to turn over to Neve to actually close. Just to summarize very quickly some of the issues that we covered. David's book, which by the way is over here, I think he's very happy to sign copies for people if they would like to have that. For me, when I read this, it has a couple of things that are really very striking about it. One is that it combines economic, political, and foreign policy history of the last 50 years in a way that is very unusual. And it shows, I think, a really interesting narrative about how decision makers in both parties, effectively, became convinced of a shift in direction, very much lobbied by business and private sector interests, which in the end has not delivered for the majority of American people. It also has some points that we covered today that gave me new ways of thinking about things. We talked about trade deficits, talked about the difference in inflation of the 1970s and the inflation that we saw here last year and the year before. I think those are important for policy reasons. And then we started a discussion tonight that was fascinating in what people contributed of what lessons do we take from this period, and what would the Democratic Party and the broader movement who do not like the way things are going at the moment do if there was a crisis and there was a chance to govern? What would that platform look like? What would the short-term things be that would build confidence? What would the longer-term economic model on social issues, the propositions put forward there look like? And I don't think we've yet come to the answer, but this type of discussion is really wonderful as a step towards it. So I want just to, before handing to Neve, to thank David very much for his time. My co-organizer, Emily Tirry, who helps very much to set up these speaker series, valiant chair of the local Democratic.
Professor David Gibbs, thank you so much. And I know you're on a flight out of here tonight. You're going to Tbilisi, right? Tbilisi, and for a conference. And Professor Gibbs is a professor of history at the University of Arizona. And I look forward to reading your book, Revolt of the Rich, How the Politics of the 1970s Widened America's Class Divide. As the Democratic Committee in Bronxville, we decided we wanted to start a speaker series, so this is our third part. And we would love some ideas from you as to where we should go from here. We'll definitely do another speaker series in the fall. Maybe we need to go in the direction of how can we help the Democratic Party after Trump completely burns everything to the ground. So, I mean, that's our goal. I also want to say